Well, this car belonged to Gus Cooper, and he owned a restaurant called Cooper's, which is now the Goat. And Skip bought it from him because it was one of the first cars he bought that wasn't a Model A or a Model T. And I remember when we were all going down to Parker's garage right before they closed it up, somebody drove this car, parked it by the gas pumps, and it was leaking gas like crazy. Remember that, the carburetor? Anyway, after that, he dropped it off and I fixed the carburetor on it.
My brother was John Borman, and he came home when he was 12 years old and informed my parents that he had bought this car, this Model T, for $10 at a sale, and they were not too happy, to tell you the truth. But he worked on it for years, and it didn't have a top when he started, but he put the top on and he painted it and he got it going. The one story I do remember is he came in the house all excited he finally got it running. But then when he went out and tried to drive it, he found out that he had two speeds in reverse and one forward. So you have to turn around, take everything out, and put it back together again.
This is a 1930 Chrysler Coupe. It was originally sold to a good friend of mine's. It would be his great aunt. She had a cottage up here, I believe, since 1927, and in 1930 bought this this Chrysler. It stayed on the island. Was taken over when I don't know the whole story, but the Sinram family, it was their aunt, Helen and Fred Sinram. They were dear friends of ours from Cleveland, Ohio, who had a summer cottage up here. They had two children, Fred and Beth, and they summered up here every year, and we were all very jealous. They were neighbors of, like I said, neighbors of ours in Cleveland. We were very jealous that they came to Put-in-Bay, and then 40 years ago I came to Put-in-Bay. Well, Fred was cleaning out the garage, Fred Jr., and this car, he wanted to get rid of it, and I said, you know, Fred, before you sell it, let me check with Skip Duggan. He may be interested in that car because of its history. And Skip and Fred got together, and Skip ended up buying it, and here it's in the museum now. It hasn't run, as Jim Wilson mentioned. Well, they said it ran when parked, but I believe this car was parked sometime in the 60s. So they're going to try to get it running, but it is a total original island car. It's never been on the mainland for any extended period of time.
I'm drinking one night with Skip, and he wants it. And I had no intention of selling it, but he got me drunk and I sold it to him. But I told him it's going to have to cost, you know, how much money I put into it. I won't charge him any labor. And that was 4 years. So I went out to his office. I had told him it's probably going to be around $6,000. Well, I got my book on it. I kept track of everything I spent on it. And I told him at that time, well, Skip, I was wrong. It wasn't 6, it's more like 8. And he looks at me and he told the secretary to make out the check.
My husband, John Borman, bought a Model T when he was just a kid. And when he got it running, he would cruise around the island with a bunch of other island kids in the car. And one night, one of the girls in the back seat was backseat driving it. So he reached down, unscrewed the steering wheel, handed it behind him and said, "Here, you drive. Don't try this at home, kids." The old timers remember my husband, John Borman, as Bullet Borman. And he got that name from Chick Lincoln because of the way he drove. Chick Linker said he drove down the street like a bullet. But I remember John creating parking places for himself. If he saw a place that looked possible on the street, he would push the car backward. He would wedge his car in and push the front car forward and the back car backward until finally he could get his car in. But I remember seeing him do that. It's just a wonder he didn't get his lights punched out.
Okay, this is a Model A taxi cab, and the seat in it is like it's really a tight fit. It's comfortable for the passengers, not so much for the driver. And Harold Howe, who was the Ford Trimotor driver, and they got a Ford Trimotor hanging over the top of this, he used to drive this thing because I guess when he was just got out of the service, he drove a taxi cab and he was familiar with it. But in one of our early parades, I was behind him in a Model T, and there were 5 or 6 cars, and we were going down along Bayview. He remembers. All of a sudden, I saw the rear wheel start to wobble. This one. And the rear wheel came off the car and went past him and went in front of him and almost fell in the lake. And Harold stopped, and we all stopped. We got out, we ran over and picked up the tire and stuck it back on. It stayed up on 3 wheels. And screwed it, found the nut laying in the road, screwed the wheel back on, and carried on with our parade.
This was the last island car in our collection that my dad bought. It was owned by Otto Herbster, the island photographer from the late 1800s and early 1900s. Most of the old photographs we have of the old hotels and all that, Mr. Herbster took, but this was his Model A Ford. And it didn't look anything like this when we got it. It was in pieces and parts. We got it restored, and it's a good restoration job.
The neat thing with Parker's Garage was that was like an introduction for me to mechanical things and cars. And they had a lead mechanic, I can't remember his name, but taught me a lot of shade tree mechanical skills, which I would never use to build a race motor these days. But we got through to fix things, oil leaks, whatever. And now we always have a tribute to Parker's Garage with the races, the sports car races. We have references to it. That was where the technical inspections were held for the races. So last year I came across this red pickup truck. It was over at this house right here, and it was for sale, so I bought it. I said, I'm going to make that a tribute to Parker's Garage. So I took it to Florida last winter and did a lot of work on the motor, replaced the brakes, did things, and then it's liveried now as what I would think a Parker's Garage truck would be. It's not an actual Parker's truck, but that's my tribute.
Well, this thing started on the island in 1926. It was used on a golf course, and the golf course went out of business in 1932, so the vehicle didn't have a lot of use on it, really. It was in good shape. And then when the golf course went broke, well, they owed different people money and things, so the tractor wound up at a guy named Slapmeyer in his garage, and he used it for a while. Anyway, it stayed there until the cruise nest started up. And when the cruise nest started up, they emptied this garage, and the tractor came out, and I saw it, and I gave Mark Book $100 for it. And I kept it for a long time, and we got it running and everything. And then I wound up, I traded to Skip Duggan for a rebuilt Model T engine, which I put in another vehicle. And now it stays here in the museum.
Not all the cars in the Skip Duggan antique car collection are in the Antique Car Museum at Perry's Cave. Some of them are scattered about the island here and there and everywhere. We just don't have room for all the cars in the Antique Car Museum. We do move them around some from time to time and switch them around. But this one is interesting. this is one of the last cars that Skip Duggan bought a couple of years before he died. He found this car in Florida, he liked it, and Skip bought it. But anyway, what's significant about this car is a couple weeks before he passed away, in January, late January of 2007, he called me. I live on Catawba Island on the mainland, and he asked me for a favor. He wanted me to go to Florida with a big enclosed trailer and his big pickup truck, and there was a lot of things Skip wanted me to do. But the main thing was he wanted this car brought back to the island, brought back from Florida, because he and his wife Sharon had talked, and they talked about selling the car, but they decided to keep it. And Sharon promised if Skip had the car brought back to this island, she promised she would learn to drive it. So at any rate, I went down that winter, shortly after he called me. I went down and I did all these things he asked me to do, and I picked up this car. But the significant thing about it was, on my way down, as I was driving through Jacksonville, Florida, his son Chip called me and said, "Jim, Dad has passed away. We know you'd like to come to the funeral, but we need you to keep going because this is something Dad wanted done." So I did. I went ahead and did all the things that Skip asked me to do, and I brought this car back a few weeks later and got it to the island. And his widow Sharon came to my house sometime in late February, a month later, and she thanked me for doing these things and bringing this car back, because Sharon said that her husband Skip would not rest until he knew that someone was on their way to pick up that car and bring it back to the island. And Sharon, for her part of it, she kept her promise. She promised if that car came back here, she would learn to drive it. And she did.
Okay, this car is an A400, and it was one of the earlier cars that Skip got. And whenever they get the parades out, you know, you'd stand around and then they'd decide who was going to drive what car. Well, this car, Model A's have a gas tank that kind of sits on your lap. It's on top of the car, and gravity feeds the engine. Well, this car had a leak in the gas tank. So whenever you drove it, it was just, you know, me and Ty would not drive this car. And it'd be like, who's going to drive that car, you know? And we call it what do we call it?
Well, it was like a death car. I mean, whoever drove it didn't know any better.
No.
Until we finally, we couldn't stand it any longer.
We took it out of service.
And Skip got the gas tank finally got fixed.
Yeah, and people would come out of there and they'd say, I smell gasoline.
It was a major job because you had to remove the gas tank.
Yeah, that was a big deal, taking the gas tank out. Anyway, that's the notable thing about this.
My father grew up on Put-in-Bay. He enjoyed playing with antique cars as a young man, like a lot of men on the island did in the 1950s and 60s. And after he became a businessman on the island in 1982, he purchased this car in Florida for my mother. Paid $15,000 for it. It was completely restored. He bought it in Fort Myers. He put it in the back of a U-Haul, brought it up here, and this is the first antique car, completely restored, that he had after he became a businessman on the island. We got it in 1982.
This is a 1923 Nash, really nice car. This one and the one next to it, the Whippet, when Skip bought them, I think he bought them at an auction out west in Oregon or somewhere like that, Washington, long ways away. But I had an outboard motor repair shop, which I worked on antique and classic outboard motors. And when these two cars came to the island, they were on a trailer, and he brought them in front of my house and pushed them off and pushed them into the driveway and said, that one leaks and that one doesn't run, and left. And so I worked on the carburetor on this thing and got up to where it ran, but it leaked like crazy. And I had to make a float for it and gaskets and things like that, and try to figure out, it's a really complicated system of the meters and whatnot. But anyway, I finally got it running, and also on this chip, Chip and I were working on this car, and I said, Chip, you want to adjust the valves on here? And he said, yep, and I showed him how to do it, and he was the last person to adjust the valves on this engine, which is a overhead valve engine, which is kind of rare for that time period. Most of them were flatheads. And your mom rode with me in this car at your daughter's wedding, and she rode in the back seat on this car.
Yeah, I know, I drove it.
Oh, okay, you were driving.
It was a good car to drive because it was real heavy, but it was so smooth. And that was probably my only time to drive it.
It had a lot of power, so you could be in like second gear and it just would go.
Anyway, it was a good wedding.
Okay, this is a 1916 Model T Coupelet. Henry Ford got this these Coupelets going because he was trying to encourage women to drive. It's a small car. The body was made by Fisher, but the drivetrain was absolutely Model T. They made them in 1914 without the opera window. In 14 they had carbide lights. In 15 they did not have the opera window. In 16 they had the opera window. 17 the top did not go up and down, but the center posts all came out. And then in 17 they discontinued it because it was not a good seller.
This is a 1926 Model T Ford, and it belonged to my uncle. It has a little bit of a bittersweet story to it. My uncle was an excellent Model T man. My dad's brother, Bruce, he had a few Model Ts here and there. And I remember the first one I really remember him having was in the late 1970s, early 1980s, but eventually he sold that. He was quite a bit older than my dad, and our car club group was growing. He didn't have a car. He didn't look right without a car. We were hoping he would get a car eventually. My dad even tried to give him a Model T. The car needed some work. My father offered to finance all the work, but he didn't want to do the work on it, or I don't really know why he didn't take the car from my dad. At one point, he thought he'd bought a Model T, and then he didn't end up, he changed his mind at the last minute. So in 1999, my uncle was 69 years old. One Sunday, we were just getting ready to start the parade. He came out, told my dad, I just mailed a check to somewhere over on the East Coast. I bought a Model T. I need you to go get it tomorrow morning. Well, my dad certainly wasn't happy about it to get that kind of a assignment placed on him. So, but my dad did it, and he went to somewhere over on the East Coast and picked it up and brought it back to Catawba, dropped it off. About 2 or 3 days later, my uncle came over to my house the night before and asked me to make the trip over to the mainland with him. All he had to do was ride the ferry boat over, get in the car and drive it on the boat. And so I went over with him. We caught the boat over in the morning, and he got into it. We had some trouble getting the car started. We were worried we were going to miss the boat. At the last second, he got the car to fire and he got it started, and he was driving it onto the ferry boat. And he had to stroke while he was driving it on the ferry boat. The ferry boat was just pulling away, and the ferry boat backed in and came back into the dock over on the mainland side. They got an ambulance for him and took him off to the hospital in Port Clinton. He lived about 3 weeks after that. That was the only time he ever got to drive the car.
This car was with the husband, and he brought it and dropped it off. I put a timing gear in this, worked on the carburetor, did quite a bit of work to this car. Got it running pretty good. And one time we drove it on the mainland to Monroeville. And I think Jack Whalen took a Model T, Bullitt took his Model T, Skip drove that car right there, that Model A. Anyway, we drove all the way to Monroeville and stopped at every bar and every little town.
I didn't go because I didn't have the guts.
But this car I drove this car, and it was really nice to drive. And the guys driving the Model T, we came back on the Bay Bridge, and the Model Ts wouldn't really go fast enough to keep up with traffic. They were, 35, 40 miles an hour was their tops, and we were always putting water in them because they were boiling out. But I was like in a luxury car with this thing. Anyway, it was a nice trip.
Some history on these Model T Speedsters. This is a 1915. A lot of the car companies were making them. Chevrolet, Chrysler, Hudson, Mercer, Stutz. So Edsel was begging his dad to make them, build them. Well, Edsel was in, Henry was into heavy production, so he wasn't interested in them. They experimented with them. But all of a sudden these aftermarket bodies start coming up, so they were all custom made in back of somebody's garage or backyard or whatever. The color was no problem with them. They actually had them souped up to do 80 miles an hour on dirt tracks, which I think their IQ had them match the speed.
This car is probably my most personal favorite car because this is 1929 Model A Ford. It belongs to me directly. Originally it belonged to Put-in-Bay native Richard Zura, 1955 graduate of Put-in-Bay High School. He either got the car in Columbus or he got it from somebody from Columbus in the 1950s. And it was always known by him and his buddies as the Blue Goose.
This is a 1924 Brewster. Brewster was manufactured, they were manufactured in New York City. They were the most expensive car in America at the time. Brewster was a high-end carriage company during the carriage times. And then in 1915, they started manufacturing their own cars. The Brewster carriages were top of the line. They were, George Washington had them, and all the very wealthy people always had Brewster carriages.
The guy that owned this car, Ernie Miller, he was lived on the island, worked at the fish hatchery, had a Stanley steamer he used to drive around, and you said he had a Studebaker. I don't remember the Studebaker.
Okay, the only reason I know about Studebaker because I wound up with some old photos of Ernie and this car, cut down car, and the car's over on Gibraltar being used over there to haul something back to South Bass Island, according to all these pictures. And one of the pictures on the back called the car Ernie's Studebaker. And by looking at all the rest of the pictures, it was a Studebaker.
This is a 1919 Ford Model T. Actually, this is known as a double T because it's an old farmer's grain truck. And the difference between a Model T and a double T, the transmission is heavier, the driveline is heavier, the rear axle is heavier, and you could have fitted this with dual rear tires. But it's an old farmer's grain truck. I don't know the history going way back. All I know is this is a vehicle that Skip Duggan bought around 20 years ago when he acquired the Perry's Cave here on South Bass Island. Can you guys talk about again what started the 4 o'clock club? How did that occur?
That name, what happened was when Skippy or somebody would stop at the winery, they'd just park their car out in front, and then somebody else would drive by and see it, and somebody else would drive by, and pretty soon there'd be a bunch of people in there. And then Bullet was usually, Bullet was pretty regular coming here in the summertime. He wasn't here in the winter.
Antique cars have always had a presence on this island because of ice fishing. A lot of places folks were getting rid of Model Ts and Model As that didn't have much value. Well, they had a lot of value here because the Ford Model Ts and Model As, they were relatively high off the ground. Okay, so they're above snow and ice. They have narrow tires and they have good low-end power. They can power through snow and ice, so they were great. They were great on the ice for ice fishing, and ice fishing has always been part of the social fabric here on South Bass Island, the village of Put-in-Bay.
This used to be in the summer the ice truck, and they used to deliver it around in about 50-pound pound and a square. And my uncle used to deliver ice with this back in when he was in college. And you can see that he must not have worked too hard because it looks pretty good shape.
Biggest reasons we still have so many Model A Fords on the island is because of the way they were used in the wintertime here. Back in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, they were really the most important vehicle for driving on the ice in the wintertime. They cut the doors off and they cut the backs out so you could easily jump out of the car if the car accidentally broke through the ice. Ice fishing is a very part of our lifestyle up here on the island.
The antique car parade. Now, I wasn't there at the time. The way I understand is was my brother Ty, Skip Duggan. I think there was like 5 or 6 of them. They were at Tony's. George Story, I think, was probably in that too. I wasn't here at the time. It was off the island. And they got overserved, and got a little too much to drink. Let's have a parade, and that's kind of how it started. And how it progressed after that, I really don't know. It's amazing what was happening to it. And of course, Skip was kind of worried, and he was very ill towards the end there, and he was worried it was going to die out on him. And they just said, no, this is going to keep on going.
I got involved in the old car parades and met some wonderful people, like Jack Whalen, like Skip Duggan, like Ron Engel, John Borman. Anyhow, I met these people and I really felt very attached to them. And so we got involved in the old car parades. Because of our involvement there, because of the wonderful job that Duggans and the Bormans did, and John actually went around and he got all these post-parade scheduled and did a lot of things. I got involved, and when we lost John, I sort of ended up with that role. So I run around and I get people to sponsor the pre-parades and the post-parades, and we just have a great time. That's what we do.